now we're going to take a look at the upper floors of the building. The client is considering letting these for office space and has heard a lot in the press recently about a growing requirement in the office market for flexible offices and co-working spaces. So, Ed, can you give us a picture of how these flexible lettings and co-working spaces can be achieved?
Before we get into how we think a flexible office or co-working type space could be put in place in this building, we just left that question on the screen there just to get you to start thinking about whether you think these types of offices are a flash in the pan or are they going to be something that's here to stay. What we'll do at the end of the session is have a Slido poll and have a look at the results. So what we're seeing at TLT is that as businesses adapt to prolonged economic insecurity, ever advancing technological demands, many businesses, both large and small, are looking, frankly, for a more flexible office occupancy arrangement. I think the ability to move in and out is very appealing, and other key attractions are the high-tech IT infrastructure, the desire these days to avoid a long-term commitment, the all-inclusive fees, and in some cases the collaborative atmosphere and the open plan environment. And what we've seen is capitalising on this trend is a growing number of providers all entering into this marketplace, offering their own brand or style take on this type of offering. So we've all heard of WeWork in the room, I'm sure. The US co-working group started off back in 2010, primarily aimed initially at tech startups, but as I'm sure we all know, now working with much larger corporates who are also interested in this kind of space. WeWork have gone from strength to strength. They've got, I think, 39 buildings in London, 2 in Manchester now. And in their wake, we've seen traditional landlords also follow suit. So British Land, for example, they now have their own flexible office offering, which they call Story. We understand they've got about 90,000 square foot let or under offer. And I think really interestingly, we've also seen non-property focused businesses enter this marketplace. So to pick an example, Ministry of Sound, the nightclub owner, one of our clients, they've now got their own brand of co-working space. So this summer, in fact, they opened a building called The Ministry in a refurbished Victorian printworks in London. So you're seeing these other types of businesses come into the same marketplace. Outside of London, there has been an increase. We understand that in terms of floor take-up by these types of providers, it's gone from 2% to 7.5% last year alone from the year before. So clearly there's a growing demand for this type of offering. And then just locally in Bristol, we've all heard of Engine Shed, and we understand Engine Shed 2 is coming online in 2020. Bristol and Bath Science Park has been around for a while now, offering the flexible office offering. And then there's been a sort of plethora of new providers all coming into the market as well. So companies like Forward Space and Pollen Place and Red Brick House all coming into the market as well. So what we've got on screen here is an illustration of the top 3 floors in the building and how they might be set out differently. So each of these floors we're going to look at in more detail, and they each illustrate a different type of offering. So at the top there we have what we call the hot desking arrangement. So that's the most kind of open space of the 3. In the middle we've got the kind of halfway house, which is what we call the dedicated space arrangement, where there are a range of sizes of different offices. And then at the bottom you've got the traditional institutional lease of a privately occupied area. So we'll go through each of these in turn. What we're going to focus on is how they can be legally structured. So hot desking, the top floor. This is the most flexible arrangement of all. It's characterised by users sort of turning up, using the space, bringing their own laptops. It's all on a first come first served basis. Nobody has their own exclusive area at all. There's sofas, there's cubby holes, there's meeting rooms that can be booked via an app. It's all very flexible, all very open. And we've seen these sorts of spaces in recent times look much less like an office and actually more like a coffee shop or private members club. There'll quite often be a bar in there, sort of football tables, that kind of thing. And I think one of the key attractions for users is the sort of open environment and the collaborative atmosphere that's engendered by that type of layout. The key thing from a legal perspective here is that no one has exclusive occupation of any area. So in property terms, pure sharing of occupation is treated as a license to occupy. So, a license to occupy, probably in this case, it would be referred to as a membership agreement. It wouldn't call itself a license to occupy, but in terms of property law, it would be the same thing. Now, what are they? Well, it's contractual permission only. So it's not an interest in land. It's not a property interest. And all it does, frankly, is stop a particular use of a property from being a trespass. It doesn't do anything more than that. So it's just purely contractual permission to do something on someone else's land. It doesn't confer any proprietary rights, so it's personal to the parties. It's not assignable. So if the landlord, for example, sold the freehold, it wouldn't be binding on their successor, and equally the member, the licensee, couldn't transfer the license to someone who acquired their business. Because they're not pure property documents, there aren't any formalities that go along with, say, a traditional lease. So there's no SDLT to pay on the rent. There aren't any land registry requirements either. And crucially, the 54 Act doesn't apply to licenses to occupy either. So, as I've said, these types of documents would probably call itself a membership agreement, and in this day and age, they'd probably be signed online or via an app rather than a sort of formal signing and exchange of documents as well. So the most flexible arrangement of all, really. So moving on now to the sort of dedicated space floor, as we've coined it. What we've got on the screen here is the sort of traditional WeWork style arrangement where there's glass boxes. I don't know if any of you guys have been to a WeWork building, but it's characterised by glass boxes, frankly, arranging for anything which is just big enough to have a desk, a chair and a printer right up to whole floors of buildings. And so what we'd tend to see in these types of spaces is where startups go in, they just need, it's just a one-man band, they go in, as the business grows, they have a bigger requirement, it's quite flexible, they can then have take more space on and grow and so on and so on. They're still not looking for a long-term commitment, they still want that flexibility to increase or decrease size as the business requirements change. They don't want to be tied into a 5 or 10 year lease. And so what they're looking for typically would be, I don't know, 6 or 12 months term perhaps, or preferably, to be honest, a rolling agreement that rolls from month to month. Now, we can, as lawyers, see the attraction for clients, landlord clients and tenants as well, to document these sorts of arrangements by way of a license. You know, licenses are much more accessible for people to read, they're less cumbersome than leases. They're more flexible, they're easier to renew, extend, vary, etc. And as we've just mentioned, they don't have any of the formalities that go along with the leases, so there's no SDLT, there's no land registry requirements either. So we can see the attraction. The downside, and where we start to get into a bit of a grey area, is where these users actually have exclusive occupation of their space. So whereas under the hot desking arrangement, the top floor, where no one's got their own space, it's all first come, first serve. Here, people have got their own rooms with locked doors. And just going back to the infamous case of Street in Mountford, I'm sure you've heard of, but what that case told us is that the key difference between a license to occupy and a lease is the occupant's ability to exclude the landlord from the premises. And another key thing about that case was the fact that the document the court was examining called itself a license to occupy. That's what the parties entered into and they had on the front of the document. But the court didn't look at what it was called, they looked at the substance of the relationship that was created by the document. And actually, because the user was being given exclusive occupation and they had the right to exclude the landlord from the property, they had a tenancy. So what are the implications? Why should we care? Well, leases of course confer proprietary rights on tenants, so it's a whole different ball game. Their interest in land, they're therefore binding on successors, completely the opposite of licenses. We know that the 54 Act applies to leases, and I should say that what the 54 Act captures are tenancies granted for terms over 6 months. So anything less than that isn't caught unless it has a clause in it saying that it can be extended beyond the 6 months, and then potentially it's caught by the Act. And another way that people can get caught out is where they think, oh great, anything less than 6 months isn't caught by the Act. But if you grant a series of agreements, let's call them that, each of, say, 5 months long, you do 3 of those, you get over 12 months, and that 12 months is quite crucial, because if any business, which could be in different ownership, but if any business has more than 12 months occupation, continuous, no matter under how many different documents, they will acquire protection under the Act. Now, as we know, if the tenant does acquire protection, then it frankly has the upper hand when it comes to renewal discussions, lease termination discussions as well. And so landlords need to be really wary of granting licenses to occupy where in fact what they're doing is giving occupants exclusive possession. So what should landlords do? Well, they should not grant licenses to occupy for more than 6 months at a time. It's quite risky to do otherwise. And they shouldn't grant a series of licenses that in total amount to a period of occupation over 12 months. And what they should do is, in the document, reserve the ability to go into the property, ideally with or without notice, which is, I know, is how we operate. Now that sounds awful from a tenant's perspective, that the landlord can just come in without any prior notice, but it is the ultimate protection for the landlord, because then they can prove that they can't be excluded from the property. Landlords should also try and reserve the ability to move tenants around in the building. So you often sort of see a lift and shift style provision where the landlord can say, right, here's some notice, you've got to move from that box, that office to that one. And that ability to move people around is a way of chipping away at their exclusive occupation of any particular area. Again, that's going to be quite unattractive for many users, I think. The disruption that it might cause to the business, of course. Another couple of things landlords should avoid doing is accepting any licence fee after the expiry of a fixed term, because what that can imply is that a periodic tenancy has arisen. A periodic tenancy is a tenancy that's framed by reference to a period of time, whether it's weekly or monthly or quarterly. So if the landlord, or perhaps their managing agents, after the end of a 6-month agreement, keep accepting rent, that can imply a periodic tenancy, and the key thing is that periodic tenancies are caught by the 54 Act, so landlords again could be caught out there. And then finally, I think just a practical thing, maybe landlords should just consider whether what they're doing is actually a lease, and then is perhaps the best thing to do, rather than getting caught up in this whole thing about is it a lease, is it a licence. If it is granting exclusive possession, just treat it as a lease. What you can do, get it outside the Act and have a rolling monthly break option, which really achieves the same thing as a rolling licence. So the private office now, this is the traditional institutional lease that we're familiar with. So here the occupier has got their own space, they've got doors that can be locked, they might have access to communal areas in the building, but they're more likely to have their own kitchen facilities, washrooms, etc. It's definitely more exclusively occupied and closed off. This model, of course, is more suited to someone who's looking for a longer term occupation, perhaps. They don't need that flexibility so much. The downside, of course, is that they do lack the flexibility of licences to occupy, as we've alluded to. They're quite cumbersome to deal with. You can only vary a lease by another deed, so you need a deed of variation. If the lease is registered, then there's a land registry application that has to go in. If there's lenders on the freehold title or the leasehold title, they need to be involved in the discussions about varying a lease. So varying a lease, whether it's to increase the size or decrease the size or change the rent, whatever it may be, it's quite a cumbersome task, quite a laborious task. And another key thing is that if you want to increase or decrease the size of the office, in law, whether you intend it or not, it's a surrender and re-grant of the lease. So that can create potentially difficult SDLT implications for the tenant. So the final thing there is that a traditional lease, it falls within the ambit of the Act, so it can be excluded if the landlord wants to, and absolutely they should be considering that if they want to retain maximum flexibility when the lease comes to an end, and to have the upper hand when it comes to termination or renewal negotiations. So we've looked at the 3 floors: the hot desking, dedicated space, the traditional office. What we're going to look at now briefly is some of the investment considerations that we see that the landlord in this case might want to take into account. So, service charge, a key issue for any landlord with a multi-let building, is always going to be full recovery of the cost of repairing and maintaining the common and retained parts of the building. So whereas a membership agreement, so the licence to occupy style, they're not going to contain detailed service charge clauses that we'd expect to see in a full-blown institutional lease. So the standard clause with the sort of quarterly on-account payments, the annual reconciliation, all of it being administered by a managing agent, just doesn't really work in a licence to occupy serviced office or co-working space arrangement. You've got a high turnover of occupants. You don't really have the ability to treat things on an annual budgeting basis with the reconciliation. And frankly, what the consumers here, the licensees, are looking for is an all-inclusive fee. So what they want is just to know, okay, I've got this one monthly payment which covers all of this. I don't want a separate rent, separate insurance rent, separate service charge. It's all going to be included in one fee. And the users as well are probably going to want some enhanced services that we'd expect perhaps more so than in a traditional lease. So things like IT support, in-house IT support would be a common one. There might be secretarial or admin support, mail handling, office supplies, on-tap beverages. That would all be, the user would all expect that to be included within their service charge. Now the key thing for the landlord, I think, the service charge is quite simply going to be pitching the fee at the right level. So they're going to be fixed in, going to be locked into that charge. So they've got to make sure, they're going to think very carefully about, is it going to be sufficient? Is it going to cover all the costs I'm expecting? And probably have a bit of a buffer for price increases along the way. Dilapidations, everyone's favourite. So in a traditional lease, the tenant has direct control over the whole demise. So in turn, the landlord expects the tenant to be responsible for all repairs when the lease comes to an end. And there's normally a specified standard. It might be a schedule of condition, it might just be words, good and substantial, whatever it may be. But the onus is on the tenant to return the property in that state. And a longer lease does allow, it has a framework to allow the parties to have a delapse negotiation. Even before the lease comes to an end, that process can get started. After the lease has expired, that conversation, discussion, negotiation can continue. Whereas in a high turnover environment with members on short-term arrangements, it just doesn't work. Parties don't have the time for that sort of discussion. And I think what the occupants are looking for is for the landlord, so it turns on its head, the landlord will be responsible for daily cleaning and repairs and upkeep of the premises. And all the tenant might sign up to is a very low standard, which will be to repair any damage that it causes beyond fair wear and tear. So the landlord accepts fair wear and tear. The tenant only has to repair things that it breaks, willfully or negligently, frankly. And again, since the landlord here has much more control over the repair of the property and a much less scope to recover a financial settlement when the lease comes to an end, what the landlord's probably want to try and do is, in that fixed monthly charge, is have in it an anticipated amount for delapse when the lease comes to an end, so they are going to be covered when the agreement does eventually come to an end. Third-party consent's another investment consideration. So if the property is charged, for example, if our landlord client here is buying the property with debt finance to take out a legal charge, they're going to need to look carefully at their facility agreement and their legal charge in the T's and C's to see if they need the lender's consent to put this sort of arrangement in place. So what you'd typically see in a legal charge is a restriction on granting leases without the lender's consent, but there might be something in there about sharing occupation as well. And if you are going to go down the route of the membership agreement or licenses to occupy, they may also be caught by the terms of the legal charge or facility agreement. I think the other thing with lenders is that it does remain to be seen, and it does differ from provider to provider, but lenders might view this type of arrangement in a slightly negative light from a management perspective. They might not like the idea of there being multiple users in occupation, some of whom are on licenses, some of whom are on membership agreements, some of whom are on leases. The lender doesn't really know who's in occupation, on what terms. It's all changing very rapidly. Potentially a management nightmare if the lender has to step in and enforce its power of sale. And then the final third-party consent is if the building here, let's assume that it was actually a long lease that the client was buying. So the long lease, it sounds obvious, but we need to check the terms of the long lease. Does the alienation covenant in that long lease allow sharing of occupation with multiple occupants in the way that we're envisaging? So going back to that slide, just to show the 3 floors again, those are some of the considerations that the lender might take into account, the client here might take into account from an investment perspective when they're considering whether to put any of these types of offices into place. And we've looked at how that can be achieved from a legal perspective. So we just brought that question up on screen again. Co-working and flexible offices, and I know I've used those terms interchangeably, but trying to sort of capture this part of the market in one go. And the question to you guys is whether you think it is a passing trend, is this just the zeitgeist for the immediate future, or is this really something that's here to stay? Yeah, so overwhelmingly I think they're on the evidence a viable investment, and I think I would definitely agree with that. I think that it is the hot topic, it is the hot trend. I think that the key thing is that it's what we're seeing is it's not just startups that want this sort of space, it's large corporates as well. And that's really the key thing, I think. And I think the market really did start in London, but what we're seeing is the growth outside of London now. And so whereas landlords might have thought, okay, this is a saturated market in London, and how am I ever going to get into this? How am I going to get a market share of this? There's massive established users, providers already. But as the market shifts and moves out to the regional cities, there's going to be a bigger pie, frankly, for providers to try and take a piece of. I think another interesting thing is that what some landlords might be attracted to is the fact that they can diversify their income streams. So they're not just providing space anymore and letting the tenants get on with it, frankly. What they can now do is provide and sell other services. So whether that's the IT support or the sort of leisure side of it, maybe a gym, maybe the refreshments, the bar area, maybe it's the admin side. So there's these other service lines that landlords can put into place and receive income for, sell more services to their users. And then I think just finally, actually another sort of key attraction that I'm seeing is that I think with landlords with large buildings, what they can, if they've got some established users in there with some empty space, what they can now offer to those established users is that if you guys have got a requirement short term for some more space, we can do this on a flexible basis. I don't know, if the client had a big project on for 12 months, we could do a flexible arrangement for that particular floor to allow you to run that project. So I think that there are a number of positives for landlords and investors, and that's definitely reflected in your opinion. So thank you.